Hi there and welcome to week 15, part 2, which is on art and architecture of the period known as the Gothic Age or the Gothic period. That stretches from about 1150 to roughly 1400 CE. It ends at different times in different places. The term Gothic, as we use it in art history, is an interesting one. It is applied to the style and culture of the late Middle Ages as early as 1550, when late Renaissance art historian Giorgio Vasari coined it to describe what he perceived to be a vulgar and barbarian style of architecture of the previous period. Now, perhaps Vasari was suffering from the prevailing form of myopia which devalued any art of the Middle Ages, for surely any thinking person could view Gothic architecture as a step toward rather than away from refinement. Though we tend to use the Vasarian form of the term Gothic today, please do not let the style term fool you. Gothic art and architecture has nothing to do with darkness and everything to do with light. Gothic architects, especially, seem to strive for a way in which to make churches and cathedrals with only light and no or little masonry. The Gothic period was a time of urbanization of Western Europe. During the Gothic period, a middle class was forming and many urban centers, most of which you would recognize today as the major cities in modern Europe. Increased urbanization of the major countries of Europe meant a different lifestyle, but not necessarily a better one for those who could make it to the cities. It is in the growing urban centers that art was often commissioned and purchased. Much of the middle class was made of merchants and craftspeople who belonged to guilds which governed activities and quality of production, and this includes artists. The trend toward university learning and away from monastery or cathedral-oriented education continued. While later Renaissance scholars would have us think that the Gothic period was a sort of dark age, it was actually a time of rediscovery of classical writings from antiquity. Contact with the Eastern world through the Crusades brought the influence of non-Christian philosophy back to Europe. Islamic scribes preserved the works of late antiquity and prevented Western culture from erasing its own history. Urban universities largely supplanted the rural monasteries of the Romanesque era as the primary centers of scholarship. Reconciliation of secular knowledge with Christianity was first attempted by supporters of the scholastic movement, such as St. Thomas Aquinas. The combination of spirituality and intellectualism will continue into the late Gothic and early Renaissance of next week. While intellectual pursuits and ancient knowledge were no longer necessarily considered antithetical to Christianity, the people continued to value mysticism in their lives. The Virgin Mary ascended in status during the Gothic period. In fact, the Catholic Church expressed concern that people were praying more frequently to the Virgin Mary than to God. Artwork and architecture bore symbols of her and the story of her life. Numerous cathedrals and abbey churches were dedicated to her. In France, where the Gothic style was born, a large number of cathedrals bear the name Notre Dame, which means Our Lady and refers to the Virgin Mary. Indeed, during the Gothic period, a really outrageous number of churches, and especially cathedrals, were built, and the volume of new projects actually seems competitive. The dominance of the hierarchy of the church was felt through the sheer number of the cathedrals, which served to house the administrative centers of the Catholic Church. This is the environment in which we find the Gothic style, which remained popular through the 1300s in many areas of Europe, as we'll see next week. The Gothic style originated in the area around Paris known as the Île-de-France. This region was under the control of the French monarchy, which was not the monolithic ruling entity that it would later become. So in case you're wondering, the Île-de-France is right in here, and Paris and Saint-Denis, as you can see, are adjacent to it. So, while there were a French king and queen, actually most of France was ruled by dukes. The French king and royal family were patrons of the Abbey Church of Saint-Denis, named for and built over the tomb of the first bishop of Paris. Perhaps ironically, in this age of cathedrals, This abbey or monastery church was the first to be fitted with elements of the Gothic style. The individual responsible for the building and decoration program at Saint-Denis, Abbot Suger, is credited by many with setting the Gothic style in motion, even with inventing the style. The facade of the church may seem at first like any Romanesque church. However, the large rose window, a circular-shaped window of stained and painted glass, easily marks the facade as Gothic in style. And you can see the rose window here. You simply just do not find these in the Romanesque era. The rose window was intended to be a metaphor for the Virgin Mary, of whom the rose is a symbol. Stained glass was wonderful for presenting narratives to its viewers. You can see some images in your book, Flight into Egypt. See if I can find a few for you. Here we go. Flight into Egypt, presenting a narrative for people to look at while they're sitting in church. Right. But stained glass, which was being used more and more frequently during the Gothic era, was also interpreted in metaphorical forms. The mystical nature of the Virgin Mary's pregnancy, the Immaculate Conception, was likened to a stained glass window. Though it looks solid, stained glass allows light to pass through without breaking it. A comparison was drawn between this observation and Mary's womb, which, though was never disturbed, was able to bear a child for God. While other elements of the church were Gothic in style, it is actually the choir of Saint-Denis that combines the architectural elements together in a way that expresses the Gothic goal, described by Abbot Suger, of divine luminosity. In the plan of the choir and views of the ambulatory and apse chapels, which we'll see shortly, you can see how Suger opened up the space. So, in the choir back here, yes, there are a number of these diagonal lines which you will recognize as rib vaulting, but underneath it is all open, except for these small little dots which represent very thin columns. So the view is practically unobstructed to the stained glass windows that adorn the exterior wall. So the effect is that all is air and light. Columns, rather than big compound piers, right, dot the choir in a way that does not contain the air or space, nor block the light streaming in through the windows. And you can see this pretty well here. See how the choir columns are very, very thin, so the light comes through very easily from behind them. Never before has the choir of a church felt so open. This emphasis on light and space is only possible through innovations in masonry, including the profuse use of rib vaulting, which you can see discussed in your book, which allowed architects to build taller, more complex, and at the same time, more structurally sound buildings. You can see a view of the rib vaulting in the choir and ambulatory in this photo. You can also see the complexity of the vault by viewing the plan, where you can see all of the rib vaulting very easily. Suger was especially influential on the style and wrote extensively about his influences. You can read a little bit more about Abbot Suger on page 497 of your book. The Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris sits on an island in the Seine River. In the views on the screen, you can see it's an excellent and early example of Gothic style. There are numerous examples of stained glass, especially in the rose windows that adorn every portal, as well as flying buttresses, which you can see here, pointed arches, which you can see, which you can see there and there and there. They're everywhere. Pointed arches everywhere. Pointed arches, pointed arches. Buttresses, pointed arches, and also pointed gables, which are these small, pointy, sort of triangular elements that you see. That's what a gable is. The flying buttresses at Paris in particular are interesting. These later buttresses are more outrageous than their earlier counterparts, but the effect is similar. The pointed arch stained glass windows that lined the upper galleries here of the nave, they are not blocked by these flying buttresses because they are open work. They are not filled with stone or masonry. In fact, they kind of resemble ribs in a way. And I feel like in this view you can see that effect a little better. So you can see all of these stained glass windows, right? A large number of them in the upper gallery, and that these flying buttresses, how open they are underneath. So there's no wall of stone blocking the windows, and yet the buttresses still actually do their job, which is to help hold up the wall of the building. The site of the Notre Dame Cathedral of Chartres had been an important goddess worship site since pre-Christian times, and it seemed like a natural place for an important Gothic church. Chartres Cathedral had one of the most cherished relics in the Catholic world, a piece of cloth worn by the Virgin Mary, given as a gift to the church by Charles the Bald back in the Carolingian era. The facade of Chartres has a prominent rose window, the panes of which are separated with what is known as tracery, a stone framework for stained glass. Chartres is remarkable for the quality and longevity of its stained glass. You can see where those panes are in the upper gallery. Take a look at a few more images that show them, all the panes of stained glass. The flying buttresses, as well as other architectural elements, can be seen in the illustration in your book and in the aerial photo as well. So this illustration, which is in your book, gives a nice detailed diagram of all the different parts of a Gothic style structure. So we've got lancets, which are the tall, skinny windows. We've got the clerestory, which is the upper row of windows. We've got portals. We've got apsidal chapels. We've got the choir, the crossing, the transept, the gables, right? All of that stuff. And of course, the rose window marked out in this illustration, which is, I believe, on page 503 in your book. It's another view with some of the flying buttresses. They aren't quite as open as the ones we saw at Paris, but you can still see that there's space in them so that light still comes through the windows to shine through the glass into the interior. Here's just a few examples of stained and painted glass, which is original from Chartres Cathedral. The royal portal on the western facade, which is the main entrance, survived the fire that destroyed the rest of the earlier Romanesque version of the church, and so its date is a little bit earlier as a result. The royal portal's central tympanum is filled with the Christ in majesty, which you can see here, surrounded by symbols of the four evangelists. Well, that sounds familiar. We were just talking about that in the Romanesque section. Generally, round proportional figures fill the portal. You can see here and there. Figures fill the voussoirs of the archways as well, which are these small blocks that make up the arches. That's what a voussoir is. But even though most of these are fairly round proportionate figures, the ones in the jambs, which are these sort of spaces in between the portals, look a little different. In fact, it seems like they're elongated quite a bit in order to fill that space. Apostles, prophets, and stories from the life of the Virgin Mary adorn the royal portal. The figures are calm and still, and in fairly sharp contrast to the lively figures of the Romanesque era. Overall, Chartres is an excellent example of the use of extensive exterior sculptural programs of the Gothic architecture. The nave of the Chartres Cathedral is also extraordinary. The many original panes of stained glass let in colorful light, especially through the clerestory of stained glass just above the nave. The rib-vaulted ceiling allowed the architects to create a vast vertical space. Like many French Gothic structures, the Cathedral of Notre Dame at Reims was built as the result of a fire bringing down an older building. Reims strikes many visitors as an exquisite example of Gothic-style elements, and indeed it belongs to a phase of Gothic architecture that we call High Gothic for that very reason. The facade especially exploits the potential of sculptural decoration. Pointed gables top pointed arches. See them there and here. This one's a little better. Pointed little gables above pointed arches, right? You can see that here, pointed gables over pointed arches again. And these portals have multiple jambs, right? So we had like 4, something like that at Chartres, and we've got more than that here for each of the portals. And so those jambs reinforce the upward motion of that pointed arch by repeating, right, that pointed arch pattern over and over in each portal. The upward direction of the gables and arches give the viewer a sense of motion upward. Now, instead of tympana, the areas above the doors are actually filled with panes of stained glass, and a very large rose window dominates the facade. The central portal's jambs contain figures that describe the scenes from the life of the Virgin Mary, which is unusual even in this era, which has much love for the Virgin Mary. You can read about these sculpture groups in your book. Take a look inside at Reims and the dominance of the stained glass. And it's even more clear if we compare even Reims and its interior and how light-filled it is just to, Chartres, or see here we can compare that to the effect at Chartres Cathedral. The effect is huge at Reims. So inside you've got this really dominating large rose window surrounded by more stained glass, a row of stained glass lancet windows, and then a smaller rose window above the main door. The very vertically oriented nave is topped with vaulting that emphasizes the pointed arch. The rose and lancet windows so dominate that from inside it nearly looks like the whole facade is filled with glass. During the later 13th century Gothic period, the French style, as it was called, transformed into the international court or rayonnant style. Louis IX, King of France and later St. Louis, was a collector of relics, and he built the church known as the Sainte-Chapelle in order to house his treasures. The Sainte-Chapelle now stands in the middle of modern Paris, but it was once part of the royal palace complex, though the lower chapel was accessible to the general public, as Louis IX wanted to share his treasures with pilgrims. The Sainte-Chapelle is typical of the rayonnant or court-style Gothic, and it almost seems that Gothic architects have finally accomplished their goal of making the walls disappear and allowing light to permeate the walls. The masonry that forms the walls between the stained glass panes is actually thicker than it is wide. I mean, take a look at that. It's quite thick, almost triple the width of each sort of buttress that you see. See how thick it is compared to how wide it is. In this way, the architect cleverly uses the walls as really their own buttress without having to add an extra buttress, and while at the same time making the walls actually seem like they disappear when you view it from the inside. This illusion is especially effective here. In this photo of the upper chapel, you can see that the walls are almost purely glass, with stone just providing a framework for the glass panes. There's an inset on the Sainte-Chapelle that you can read in your book. The prominence of stained glass seems to influence other art forms, including manuscript illumination, which continued to be a very important art form in the city of Paris especially. In this first page from the Moralized Bible, a tracery-like framework contains the colorful and shining golden images of French King Louis IX and his regent Queen Blanche. A Moralized Bible relied heavily on illustrations, which were used to help draw connections between biblical stories for the reader. A text page on the screen displays some of these illustrations, which too are contained in stained glass-like medallions. In Germany, where the Gothic style remained popular through the 15th century, architectural sculpture took on a portrait-like quality. We have two examples for you that exhibit this quality. First is the image of Saint Maurice, and then later we'll take a look shortly at the images of church elders Eckhard and Ute. They're all carved in a realistic manner and painted to seem more lifelike. The psychological presence of all three figures is massive, and the attention to realistic detail in St. Maurice's appearance, as he was African, and his military garb is matched by the small, humanistic details of Eckhard and Ute. In Italy, as we might expect, the Roman past remains highly influential. In general, the Gothic style was not well liked in Italy, and overall it was not adopted. Rightly or wrongly, Gothic art was perceived in Italy as too unrealistic, too lacking in classical elements. Italian artists preferred their ancient Greco-Roman models. The pulpit from the baptistry at Pisa, which we saw in Part 1, like our Modena example, also from Part 1, uses Roman sarcophagus and altar sculpture as models. The pulpit panel's figures are very three-dimensional. Are very three-dimensional, and they seem to exist in real space even when the narrative composition doesn't lend itself to realism. That ends our week on Romanesque and Gothic art, and next week we'll have our last week of class. Week 16 wraps up the course with a discussion of the 14th century and chapter 18.